Our next presenter is Michael Bennett, presenting on 3D data acquisition, visualization, and archiving of selected lithics from the Caldwell collection. Michael, thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. I hope everyone can see that. I'd like to start by thanking SFIT for approving the outline of the strategic engagement idea back in early September of last year. Thanks for that quite a bit. Okay, so let me start. This project was an interesting cross-campus collaboration among the Anthropology Department, the Connecticut State Museum of Natural History, the Office of the State Archaeologist, and the University Library. Here's a list of the working group members, some of whom I'll circle back to in a bit. The idea here was to take a newly developed 3D digitization technique and workflow and to explore how its rendered outputs could be leveraged for possible educational and scholarly use. During spring 2020, I conducted initial experiments with small objects in extreme close-range photogrammetry through focus stacking to create 3D recordings with full object views. And I'll illustrate this in a second. Photo stacking involves the acquisition of a bracket of images with varying focal points. These are then focus stacked through computational means into final rendered images that possess an increased depth of field that are usable for subsequent photogrammetric processing. And this is the rig that I used at home. It's a home studio setup. A brief note on the State Museum's Caldwell collection that we worked on. They were selected in the late summer of 2020 in collaboration with Professor Tryon based upon his research interests and their possible suitability for lab assignments in his human evolution course that was going to be taught online in spring 2021. The artifacts whose transfer to me was facilitated by Dr. Robert were mostly very small stone points, as you can see here, with some dating back to the Middle Paleolithic range of 28,000 to 35,000 years before present. So these were ancient, humbling, and exciting items to work with. As you can see, a very close focus was used during the acquisition process with a relatively long 100mm macro lens. By the way, the device with the caution label on it is what is known as a focus rail, and I'll talk a bit more on that in a second. In essence, here is the technical challenge. It's basically an optical imaging and computational problem. Photogrammetry, in essence, relies on computer vision to interpret surface volume from 2D source images, and it needs things in focus to do that. Here you can see, hopefully, the first and last images in a sample focus bracketed range of images. You'll notice in the left view how the point's nearest ear is in focus while the rest of the lithic gradually falls out of focus. In the right view, the far ear is in focus. Between these two, an incremental series or bracket of shots were automatically taken by moving the camera a programmed distance along the focus rails closer to the object. No lens refocusing is involved during this process. And here's an example of how one given overall shooting session was programmed for one object orientation. Basically, 42 bracketed shots per object position on the turntable, 35 total 10-degree turntable moves between each focus bracketed series of shots, which of course leads to a lot of shooting. Luckily, it can be mostly accomplished unattended through programming and automation, and that's mostly done through this device that you're looking at. With these images, you can then computationally focus stack each bracketed series within software into a final image that has in-focus depth of field throughout an entire object. So if you think back on that previous slide, hopefully you can see the difference where this stone point is completely in focus. Okay, so that's focus stacking. Here's the second piece. It's called photogrammetry. It's basically the creation of 3D data from 2D images. It's very cool stuff, capable of very high precision and accuracy. Here's an example of a final textured 3D model, which is in the middle of the screen, as rendered in photogrammetry software. The blue squares represent focus stacked images and their relative location during the shooting session. So those blue squares are all the photo stacked renderings for the session. And here you can get a sense, hopefully, of the sub-millimeter levels of both visual and geometric detail that can result in a 3D rendering combining these techniques. Let's take a second to do a deeper dive on that same point and its metrics. With this much raw data and precision and accuracy come lots of required overall computation. So you can see we're at the micron level of both sampling and estimated resolution, but we're capturing a lot of images through this process. But there's hardware to help. Here I'm installing an 8 GB Radeon Pro graphics card into a Razer external GPU enclosure. I was very excited about this. Both the focus stacking and photogrammetry software programs that I use are optimized to use such a device and can elegantly leverage external GPU power when connected to something like a MacBook. Okay, so what do you get out of all of this? For one, a better and more flexible means of traditional max height and max width measurements of stone points. This can now be done in software and in a more distributed and shared manner for classroom and scholarly use, since this is all now in the digital realm. You can also make angle among notable physical features. And you can do cross sections not realistically feasible with the original objects, but now they're made easy and maybe more importantly, measurable in software using these digital surrogates. Various lighting angles are also possible. Here you can see how I'm using raking light within MeshLab to bring out aspects of surface topography. And here's an example of both raking light and sub-millimeter measurement going on. And if you think back, this is the same stone point that I was holding on top of my finger, so really small. So what was learned? Basically that a novel combined focus stacking photogrammetry technique can consistently work in full 3D views for small lithics. This workflow can also be operationalized and its rendered outputs can have direct use in online class instruction. Something else we also learned was something that we knew going into the project, which was that the resulting 3D data sets would probably push the CTDA beyond its traditional operating norms, and it did. However, hitting the hard download threshold that we experienced resulted in a clear sense of the current limitations of the CTDA's use for such large cultural heritage data sets and served as a guide to hopefully surmount these caps in the near future. The rendered 3D models are all up on Sketchfab. So I finished 19 of these. Some of these have 2 versions. I made shaded versions of a few of these. So they're up on Sketchfab on that link. And here is the ongoing full dataset work that we're doing within CTDA. So these contain all the source images and other dependent files that go into a given 3D rendered object. Taken together, these datasets are important for overall transparency, reproducibility of methods, and to further showcase the important roles that libraries and the open data that they host can play in 3D research and reuse. Here are some additional resources, including an article that I recently authored on the project that's in the current issue of Code for Live journal. And echoing that article's acknowledgements, I'd like to take a moment to express particular thanks to my working group colleagues from the library, Rhonda Kaufman and Mike Kamisis. It was great working with you on this, and I hope that we can keep the collaboration rolling. Future work, well, I'll just leave you with this image. This is a sample, a specimen from our recent Brood X folks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael.